The Beatles changed music forever, but behind their legendary melodies lay a world of bizarre recording experiments, failed inventions, and incidents so strange they'd make tabloid writers blush. From tea towels dampening drums to a Greek wizard who promised flying saucers, and from concerts that allegedly smelled of urine to accidental LSD trips in the studio, the Fab Four's journey was far weirder than any Yellow Submarine lyric could capture. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about the Beatles. Fact 1. The Thing George's Vomit became a band member. During their rough and tumble days in Hamburg, Germany, the Beatles encountered living conditions that would make most people cringe, but perhaps nothing was quite as disgusting as what happened in their shared hostel room in 1960. According to Pete Best, the band's original drummer who witnessed the entire ordeal, George Harrison became violently ill one night and vomited on the floor of their cramped accommodation. What happened next reveals just how young and perhaps immature the future superstars really were at the time. Rather than immediately cleaning up the mess, the four teenagers simply stared at the pool of vomit and decided that none of them could stomach the task of dealing with it. Days passed, and the disgusting puddle remained exactly where George had left it, slowly becoming a permanent fixture in their already less than luxurious living space. The Beatles were forced to step around the mess every single day, yet somehow none of them could bring themselves to grab a mop or even a towel to address the situation. As the days turned into weeks, something truly bizarre happened. The band members began to treat the revolting puddle as if it were actually alive, giving it the nickname The Thing, and joking that it had become an honorary fifth member of the Beatles. Pete Best later recalled how the group would talk to the vomit as if it were a person, and they even started considering it part of their daily routine in Hamburg. The disgusting pool remained on the floor for a full 2 weeks before someone finally worked up the courage to clean it up. This incident perfectly captures the chaotic and unsanitary conditions the Beatles endured during their formative years in Hamburg's red light district, where they were essentially just teenagers trying to make it in the music business while living in absolutely terrible circumstances that would shape their bond as a group. Fact 2. Ringo used John's harmonica as drum equipment. Long before expensive studio equipment and fancy sound dampening devices became standard in recording studios, Ringo Starr was already experimenting with bizarre household items to create the perfect drum sound. As early as 1962, Ringo could be seen placing John Lennon's harmonica directly on top of his snare drum to muffle the sound and create a completely different tone than what traditional drumming techniques would produce. This wasn't just a one-time experiment either, because Ringo quickly discovered that almost any small object could dramatically change how his drums sounded during recording sessions. He would regularly place cigarette packs on his snare drum to dampen the sharp crack, or he might lay his wallet across the drumhead to create a softer, more controlled sound. Tea towels became another favorite tool, and Ringo would drape them over his tom drums to reduce their volume and alter their natural resonance in ways that sounded completely unique on the finished recordings. What makes this even more impressive is that Ringo was essentially inventing modern drum recording techniques decades before they became industry standards. He would experiment with how hard or soft he hit each drum, use masking tape to adjust the sound, or even remove drum heads entirely depending on what the song needed. The placement of microphones around his kit was also part of his creative process, and he would work with engineers to find the exact position that captured the sound he was hearing in his head. These simple but effective ideas that Ringo developed with everyday objects eventually became some of the biggest trade secrets in the Beatles' recording process. Professional studios today use expensive equipment to achieve the same muffled and controlled drum sounds that Ringo was creating with John's harmonica and a few household items, proving that creativity and experimentation often matter more than having the most expensive gear available. Fact 3. Paul's F-bomb in Hey Jude, hidden within one of the Beatles' most beloved and frequently played songs, is a moment of pure human frustration that somehow made it into the final recording and has been heard by millions of listeners for decades. At exactly 2 minutes and 57 seconds into Hey Jude, Paul McCartney can be heard muttering an F-bomb under his breath after he accidentally played the wrong chord during what was supposed to be a perfect take of the song. The mistake happened during the recording sessions when Paul was concentrating intensely on his piano performance, and the wrong chord completely threw off his rhythm and focus in the middle of an otherwise beautiful rendition. His immediate reaction was to express his frustration with a quiet but clearly audible curse word that got picked up by the sensitive studio microphones that were positioned close to the piano to capture every nuance of his playing. What makes this moment truly fascinating is that the Beatles and their producer George Martin made the deliberate decision to keep Paul's mistake and his frustrated reaction in the final version of the song that would be released to the public, rather than doing another take or editing out the profanity. They felt that Paul's genuine emotional response actually added something authentic and human to the recording that perfectly matched the raw, heartfelt nature of the song itself. The F-bomb is still there today in every remastered version of Hey Jude that gets played on streaming platforms, radio stations, and in movies around the world. Most casual listeners have never noticed it because it happens so quickly, and Paul says it quietly. But once you know where to listen for it, the moment becomes impossible to ignore. This small imperfection that the Beatles chose to preserve shows how they valued emotional honesty over technical perfection, even when it meant including a swear word in one of their most popular and enduring songs. Fact 4. The backwards discovery that changed music. One of the most revolutionary techniques in rock music history came about through a simple accident that happened in John Lennon's home studio while he was allegedly under the influence of marijuana. After finishing work on the song Rain during 1966, John took a copy of the recording home with him on a reel-to-reel tape, but when he went to play it back later that evening, he accidentally loaded the tape onto his machine backwards without realizing his mistake. When the tape started playing in reverse, John heard his own voice singing the lyrics to Rain completely backwards, creating an otherworldly and haunting sound that immediately captured his attention and sparked his creative imagination. According to John himself, he was so fascinated by this accidental discovery that he knew right away he had stumbled onto something completely new and exciting that could be incorporated into the Beatles' music in ways that no rock band had ever attempted before. John was so enthusiastic about this backwards vocal effect that he convinced the rest of the band to include it in the final version of Rain, making it the very first rock song to feature backwards vocals as an intentional artistic choice. The technique involved John singing the first verse of the song normally during recording, then playing that vocal track in reverse, and adding it as an overdub to create the mysterious backwards effect that listeners hear at the end of the finished song. This accidental discovery opened up an entirely new world of experimental recording techniques for the Beatles, and they quickly followed up with reversed guitar parts on I'm Only Sleeping, where George Harrison played his guitar solos backwards to create sounds that would have been impossible to achieve through conventional playing methods. The backwards recording technique that John stumbled upon by accident became a signature element of the Beatles' psychedelic period and influenced countless other musicians to experiment with tape manipulation and reverse recording effects. Fact 5. A bed in the recording studio. During the recording sessions for Abbey Road in 1969, visitors to the famous Studio 2 would have encountered one of the most unusual pieces of furniture ever brought into a professional recording environment. A full-sized double bed positioned right in the middle of the workspace where the Beatles were creating what would become their final album together. John Lennon had specifically requested that this bed be installed so that his wife Yoko Ono could be present for every single recording session while she recovered from injuries sustained in a serious car accident. Yoko had been badly hurt in a car crash in Scotland during the summer of 1969, and her injuries were severe enough that she needed to remain lying down for extended periods while her body healed from the trauma. Rather than leave Yoko at home or in the hospital during the crucial Abbey Road recording sessions, John made the unprecedented decision to bring a bed directly into the studio so she could participate in the creative process without compromising her medical recovery. This arrangement meant that Yoko was literally lying in bed just a few feet away from where Paul McCartney was playing bass. George Harrison was recording guitar parts, and Ringo Starr was behind his drum kit. The other Beatles had already grown accustomed to Yoko's constant presence during recording sessions. But having an actual bed in the studio took this unusual dynamic to an entirely new level that no recording studio had ever experienced before. The bed became a permanent fixture throughout the Abbey Road sessions, and Yoko would often offer creative input and commentary on the songs, while resting comfortably under the covers. This bizarre setup perfectly captured the strange and tense atmosphere that surrounded the Beatles during their final months as a band. When personal relationships and creative partnerships were becoming increasingly complicated and unconventional compared to their earlier recording experiences together. Fact 6. The Dentist's LSD Trick. In 1965, John Lennon and George Harrison experienced their first LSD trip in the most unexpected and disturbing way possible, when a dentist friend secretly drugged them during what they believed was simply a pleasant dinner party at his home. The dentist, whose name was John Riley, had invited John Lennon, George Harrison, and their wives Cynthia Lennon and Pattie Boyd to his house for an evening meal. But he had planned something far more dangerous than his guests could have ever imagined. After dinner was finished, and the group had moved to the living room for coffee, Riley quietly slipped LSD into everyone's drinks without telling any of his guests what he was doing or asking for their permission to give them a powerful psychedelic drug. At this time in the mid-1960s, LSD was still a relatively unknown substance to most people, and the Beatles had no idea what was happening to them when they started feeling the intense effects of the drug taking hold of their minds and bodies. George Harrison later described Riley as the wicked dentist when recalling this traumatic experience, and he remembered how the room seemed to grow as large as the Albert Hall, while he felt like he was falling in love with everyone he met that night. Cynthia Lennon also described the terrifying experience of not understanding why reality was suddenly shifting around her in ways that made no logical sense at all. The effects of this unwanted drug experience were so intense and overwhelming that John and George became genuinely frightened about what was happening to them, especially since they had no context for understanding the psychedelic effects they were experiencing. This incident marked the Beatles' first encounter with LSD, though it would not be their last, and the traumatic nature of being drugged without consent left a lasting impression on both musicians about the power and unpredictability of psychedelic substances. Fact 7. Abbey Road was almost called Everest. One of the most iconic album covers in rock history almost never happened because the Beatles originally had a completely different and far more ambitious plan for what would become their final studio album together. During the early planning stages for Abbey Road in 1969, the band decided they wanted to call the album Everest, as a tribute to engineer Geoff Emerick, whose favorite brand of cigarettes happened to be called Everest, making the title an inside joke that only the studio crew would fully understand. Once they had settled on the Everest name, the Beatles began making serious plans to travel all the way to Mount Everest in Tibet to photograph the album cover at the base of the world's tallest mountain, which would have created one of the most spectacular and expensive album covers ever attempted by any musical group. The logistics of such a trip would have been incredibly complicated and costly, requiring the band to organize international travel, mountain climbing equipment, professional photographers, and permits to access the remote Himalayan region. However, as the album sessions progressed and the band members became more focused on finishing their recording work, someone in the group finally spoke up and suggested that maybe they should reconsider the elaborate mountain expedition. According to Paul McCartney's recollection of the decision-making process, one of the Beatles essentially said they couldn't be bothered to travel all the way to the Himalayas just to take a photograph, especially when they would get cold and exhausted from the difficult journey. Instead of Mount Everest, the band made the spontaneous decision to simply walk outside Abbey Road Studios and take their album cover photograph on the street directly in front of the building where they had spent countless hours recording their music. This last-minute change resulted in the famous crosswalk image that became one of the most recognizable and frequently imitated album covers in music history, proving that sometimes the simplest ideas work better than the most elaborate plans. Fact 8. George's flaming ashtray performance. During one of the most chaotic and intense recording sessions for the Beatles' White Album in 1968, George Harrison decided to express the wild energy of Helter Skelter by literally setting an ashtray on fire and running around Abbey Road Studios while holding the flaming object high above his head like some kind of primitive torch. This bizarre incident perfectly captured the frenzied and unpredictable atmosphere that had taken over the Beatles' recording sessions during this turbulent period when the band members were increasingly at odds with each other both personally and creatively. Helter Skelter was already one of the Beatles' most aggressive and experimental songs, featuring distorted guitars, pounding drums, and Paul McCartney's screaming vocals that pushed the boundaries of what rock music could sound like in the late 1960s. The song was meant to be louder, harder, and more chaotic than anything the Beatles had ever recorded before, so George's decision to run around the studio with a flaming ashtray actually made perfect sense within the context of what they were trying to achieve musically. The White Album sessions were notorious for the tensions and strange behavior that emerged as the Beatles struggled with creative differences, personal relationships, and the general stress of being the world's most famous band while trying to evolve their sound in new directions. During this same period, Ringo Starr temporarily quit the band. Paul McCartney and John Lennon were barely speaking to each other, and producer George Martin actually left the sessions to go on vacation because he was frustrated with how difficult the band had become to work with. George's flaming ashtray performance was just one example of how the normally quiet and reserved guitarist was finding ways to channel his own frustrations and creative energy during these difficult recording sessions. The incident has become legendary among Beatles fans and recording engineers as a symbol of how far the band was willing to go to capture the raw, unfiltered emotions they were experiencing during the creation of their experimental double album. Fact 9. The Greek Island Utopia Plan. In 1967, during the height of their psychedelic period and growing disillusionment with modern society, the Beatles seriously discussed purchasing an entire Greek island where they could establish a utopian community for themselves, their families, and their closest friends to live together away from the pressures and problems of the outside world. John Lennon was the most enthusiastic supporter of this ambitious plan, arguing that humanity had already tried every other form of social organization without success, and that it was time to experiment with something completely different. John's reasoning for the island community was remarkably idealistic and reflected the countercultural thinking that was influencing many young people during the late 1960s. He told the other Beatles that wars, nationalism, fascism, communism, capitalism, religion, and general nastiness had all failed to create a peaceful and happy society, so why not try building their own alternative community where they could live according to their own values and principles without interference from governments or traditional institutions. The Beatles actually went as far as scouting potential islands off the coast of Athens and making preliminary inquiries about purchasing property in Greece, showing just how seriously they were considering this radical lifestyle change. The plan involved bringing their wives, children, and close friends to live together in a self-sufficient community where they could make music, raise their families, and explore new ways of living that weren't constrained by conventional social expectations or commercial pressures. However, Paul McCartney eventually emerged as the voice of reason who pointed out the practical problems with the utopian island plan. In his book, Many Years From Now, Paul explained that it was probably a good thing they didn't follow through with the idea because there would inevitably be arguments about who had to do the washing up and whose turn it was to clean out the latrines, proving that even in paradise, someone still has to handle the mundane but necessary tasks of daily life. Fact 10. The Christmas Horse Dinner. On Christmas Day in 1962, the Beatles found themselves sitting down to one of the most unusual holiday meals of their lives. when they ate horse meat for their Christmas dinner during their second stint performing in Hamburg, Germany. This bizarre Christmas feast perfectly illustrated just how difficult and desperate the living conditions were for the young musicians, as they struggled to make a name for themselves in the rough entertainment district of Hamburg red light area. The Beatles had returned to Hamburg after their earlier experiences playing in the seedy clubs and living in terrible accommodations that barely qualified as suitable for human habitation. During this second trip to Germany, the band was still earning very little money and had to take whatever food they could get, even if it meant eating meat from animals that most British people would never consider consuming under normal circumstances. Horse meat was more commonly available and affordable in Germany than traditional meats like beef or pork, especially for struggling young musicians who were barely scraping together enough money to survive while pursuing their dreams of musical success. The fact that the Beatles were willing to eat horse meat on Christmas Day shows just how far they were from the comfortable middle-class lives they had known back in Liverpool, and how desperately they wanted to succeed as performers despite the harsh realities of their situation. This unusual Christmas dinner took place during a crucial period in the Beatles' development as a band, when they were learning to perform for hours every night in front of rowdy German audiences who demanded high energy and non-stop entertainment. The extreme conditions they endured in Hamburg, including eating horse meat for Christmas, helped toughen them up as performers and brought them closer together as a group, creating bonds that would sustain them through the incredible success that was waiting for them just around the corner when they returned to England and began their rise to international fame. Fact 11. The condom fire deportation. Paul McCartney and Pete Best found themselves in serious legal trouble with German authorities when they decided to light a condom on fire in their cramped room at the Bambino Cinema in Hamburg, turning what should have been a simple departure from Germany into an international incident that resulted in their arrest and immediate deportation. This bizarre episode occurred during the Beatles' first stint in Hamburg in 1960, when the band was already planning to leave the venue due to poor working conditions and terrible living arrangements. The Bambino was a seedy adult cinema where the Beatles had been living in squalid conditions behind the movie screen, sleeping in tiny rooms that were barely suitable for storage, let alone human habitation. The band had been forced to use the cinema's public restrooms for washing and shaving, and they were generally treated poorly by the venue's management, which had created mounting frustration among the young musicians who were eager to move on to better opportunities. When Paul and Pete decided to create their makeshift torch by setting the condom ablaze, they probably thought it was just a harmless prank or a way to provide some light in their dark and dingy accommodations. However, the owner of the Bambino was absolutely furious when he discovered what they had done, viewing their actions as dangerous and destructive behavior that could have easily started a serious fire in his building. The incident escalated quickly when the cinema owner called the German police, who arrested Paul McCartney and Pete Best on charges related to attempting to burn down the building. The two Beatles were thrown in jail overnight and then deported from Germany the very next day, forcing them to make a hasty and humiliating exit from Hamburg while the rest of the band scrambled to figure out their next move. This condom fire incident became one of the most embarrassing moments in the Beatles' early career and showed just how precarious their situation was during those difficult formative years. Fact 12. Using a loudspeaker as a microphone. When the Beatles were recording Paperback Writer in 1966, engineer Geoff Emerick faced a challenge that seemed impossible to solve using conventional recording equipment. John Lennon had heard the incredibly powerful bass sound on a Wilson Pickett record and demanded to know why the Beatles couldn't achieve that same earth-shaking low-end punch on their own recordings. Rather than accepting the limitations of standard microphones and recording techniques, Emerick came up with one of the most innovative and bizarre solutions in recording history by literally using a loudspeaker as a microphone. The technique involved positioning a regular loudspeaker directly in front of Paul McCartney's bass amplifier speaker, creating a setup that looked completely backwards to anyone familiar with normal recording procedures. Instead of using the loudspeaker to produce sound as it was designed to do, Emmerich used it to capture sound by taking advantage of the fact that loudspeakers and microphones work on basically the same principle, just in reverse directions. When Paul played his Rickenbacker bass through his amplifier, the sound waves from the bass speaker caused the diaphragm inside the second loudspeaker to move back and forth, which generated electrical current that could be fed directly into the recording console. This unconventional approach allowed Emmerich to capture incredibly deep and powerful bass frequencies that traditional microphones simply couldn't handle without distorting or breaking down under the intense pressure of low-frequency sound waves. The result was a bass sound that had never been heard on a pop record before, with Paperback Writer featuring low-end frequencies that were so powerful and clear they practically jumped out of radio speakers and record players when the song was released. Emmerich's loudspeaker as microphone technique became one of the most closely guarded secrets in the Beatles' recording arsenal, and it took decades before other engineers figured out how this revolutionary bass sound had been achieved in the studio. Fact 13. The 24-hour mixing marathon. Near the end of creating their massive double album known as the White Album in 1968, the Beatles held their first and only 24-hour recording session in Abbey Road Studios, with John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and producer George Martin working continuously around the clock to complete the final mixing and sequencing for what would become one of their most ambitious and complex musical projects. This marathon session was particularly remarkable because it represented the only time in the Beatles' entire recording career that they committed to working for a full day and night without taking any significant breaks. The White Album had been an exhausting and emotionally draining project for everyone involved, with tensions running high between band members and the recording process stretching on for months as they experimented with dozens of different songs and musical styles. By the time they reached the final stages of production, there was enormous pressure to finish the album and get it ready for release, which required making countless decisions about how each song should sound and in what order they should appear on the finished record. During this intensive 24-hour session, John Lennon took control of one aspect of the mixing process by manually adding chamber echo to track 3, while Paul McCartney focused on controlling the volume levels for the same track, and George Martin handled the master volume for the main output channel. This hands-on approach meant that all three men had to stay constantly alert and focused throughout the entire day and night, making real-time adjustments to the sound as they listened to each song over and over again. Author Mark Lewison documented this historic session and noted that it was completely unprecedented in the Beatles' working methods, which typically involved shorter recording sessions spread out over many weeks or months. The 24-hour marathon perfectly captured the intense pressure and creative dedication that went into completing the White Album during one of the most difficult periods in the band's history together. Fact 14. Concert venues. Cleaned up underwear. After Beatles concerts during the height of Beatlemania in the mid-1960s, venue cleaning crews regularly discovered dozens of pairs of abandoned underwear scattered throughout the theaters and concert halls, left behind by hysterically excited female fans who had literally lost control during the performances. This bizarre cleanup task became such a common occurrence that venue managers began to expect and plan for the unusual aftermath of hosting the Beatles, knowing that their cleaning staff would need extra time to collect intimate garments along with the usual concert debris. One of the most documented examples of this phenomenon occurred at a theater in Hull, England, where actress Maureen Lipman attended a Beatles concert as a skeptical observer, but ended up experiencing what she later described as her Road to Damascus moment, when John Lennon sang, "Money, That's What I Want." Lipman recalled that she heard someone very close to her scream, the most piercing scream, which she described as a primal mating call, only to realize with electric shock that the screaming person was actually herself. After this particular Hull concert, the theater staff reportedly cleared away 40 pairs of abandoned knickers from young female fans who had become so overwhelmed by the experience that they had apparently removed their underwear during the show. Multiple venue owners and staff members from different Beatles concerts confirmed similar discoveries, with John B. Lynn, whose father owned a venue where the Beatles performed, telling the Washington Post that concert halls regularly smelled like urine from overexcited girls after the shows ended. Bob Geldof also recalled the intensity of Beatles concerts, describing them as a case of watching females in a state of extreme excitement, noting that you couldn't hear the music for all the screaming that filled the venues. This unusual combination of abandoned underwear and other evidence of fan hysteria became one of the most memorable and frequently discussed aspects of Beatlemania, illustrating just how powerfully the Beatles affected their audiences during live performances. Fact 15. The Manila Palace Snub Incident. When the Beatles arrived in Manila, Philippines on July 4, 1966, they had no idea that First Lady Imelda Marcos had invited them to a breakfast reception at the Malacañang Palace, and their failure to attend this event that they knew nothing about would turn into one of the most dangerous and terrifying experiences of their entire career. The band members were exhausted from their grueling tour schedule and simply wanted to rest in their hotel rooms before their evening concerts, but their manager Brian Epstein had failed to properly communicate the palace invitation, creating a diplomatic disaster that would put their lives in serious danger. When the Beatles didn't show up for the breakfast with Imelda Marcos and her children, the Philippine government and media immediately interpreted their absence as a deliberate and insulting snub of the country's most powerful political family. The Manila Times newspaper ran a headline that screamed, "Beatles snub First Lady!" And the story quickly spread throughout the Philippines, turning public opinion against the band and creating a hostile atmosphere that made their situation increasingly dangerous. The backlash was swift and violent, with the Beatles losing their police protection and security detail as angry crowds began gathering outside their hotel and at the airport where they were trying to leave the country. When the band members finally made it to the airport, they were forced to carry their own guitars and equipment while pushing through crowds of furious citizens who were shouting, spitting, and trying to physically attack them for their perceived insult to the First Lady. Even after reaching the airport, the Beatles weren't allowed to leave until they paid what the Philippine authorities called taxes, but which were clearly punitive fees designed to punish them for the diplomatic incident. Paul McCartney later noted with dark humor that the amount they were forced to pay was strangely similar to the total receipts from their concert performances, suggesting that the government had essentially confiscated their entire earnings from the trip as punishment for accidentally snubbing Imelda Marcos.